Everyone, my name is Dr. Jamie Pearson, and I am an assistant professor of special education at North Carolina State University. I run a FACES program at NC State, and so I'm going to be talking to you about that today. But just to give you a little bit of background information about myself, I have about 12 years of experience supporting autistic youth and their families. And I've worked in both home and school, homeschool and community environments, really passionate about supporting the needs of historically marginalized youth, autistic youth. And so today I'm going to talk about FACES for educators. FACES stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And this is for Black autistic youth and their families. Our objectives for this webcast are to identify strategies that facilitate ongoing communication and collaboration between families and educators. We're also going to identify tools that educators can employ to support autistic youth and their families via community-based programming and partnerships. And then we're going to develop a plan to reach historically marginalized autistic youth and their families in their communities. So a quick review on disparities. If you joined us in webcast 1 of this series, you'll remember a bit about this, but I wanted us to do a little bit of an overview before we jump into FACES. And so these are some headlines from news articles that have been in the news over the past years that are highlighting the racial and ethnic disparities that we see in autism diagnoses and autism supports, and in just those general outcomes related to autism among historically marginalized families. And so one example of those headlines is that diagnosis timeline drags for Black autistic children. For Black kids, autism is caught late in the game. Raising BIPOC children with autism, parents struggle to find support. And then family navigation helps reduce disparities in autism diagnoses. So these are a few examples of the headlines that really highlight the disparities that we see with regard to autism diagnoses and experiences. And they really point to many of those disparities that we discussed in webcast 1. And so for historically marginalized children with autism, particularly those who identify as Black and Latino, we see less adequate services. We often see lower quality curriculum and instruction. We see that Black and Latino children are served in self-contained classrooms more often than white children. And then generally there's that disproportionate representation in special education. For example, Black children make up about 15% of the population of students in public schools in the United States. However, they represent 20% of the population of students who receive special ed services in public schools in the United States. And so there's a mismatch or a disproportionate representation of Black children in particular in special education. And so I wanted us to revisit some of these disparities just to kind of quickly highlight what those are before we go into more around how we address those. One other thing that I'll note briefly before we jump into that is that Black and Latino children are diagnosed less often and take more time to receive diagnoses, identification, access to evaluation, sort of that whole navigation process tends to take more time for Black and Brown families. And so we design FACES in an effort to address those disparities and to build supports for Black families raising autistic youth. And so again, FACES stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And it's a community-engaged empowerment and advocacy program designed to give and build agency in Black families so that they feel more empowered, so that they have more agency, so that they have more knowledge and feel essentially empowered to be able to advocate more effectively to address their needs and also their children's needs with regard to access to autism services and related services for their children. And so the goals of FACES are to do most of what I just kind of said there, addressing disparities among Black families increasing equity and access to services for Black autistic youth, and then increasing that service utilization. And I like to kind of distinguish between equity and access versus service utilization, right? Because we might have access to a particular service. However, if we're not utilizing their service, then we need to understand why. And for many Black families, the reason why they're not utilizing services comes down to cultural mismatch, or it comes down to inaccessibility, or it comes down to limited inclusivity. And so we need to be thinking beyond just, do I have access to a particular support? And thinking more specifically about, how do I sustain engagement with that particular support, particularly among historically marginalized families. And so those are the goals of the FACES program. So I'm going to pause here and actually let you hear from some of our previous FACES participants. These are families who went through our 6-week training, and they got to learn a little bit about special education law. They learned about advocacy techniques and strategies. They were able to build a really strong sense of community with the other participants in the program. And so at the end of the 6 weeks, we asked them just to sit down and share their views, just a very sort of open-ended prompt, like, what did you learn from this experience? And so I'll let you listen to our previous FACES families.
Well, what I feel like I've learned from this experience is just how important it is to learn the resources from your community, because community can be a big and huge help in successfully see my role as a parent and a partner on the path of an autistic child.
Coming in here, we kind of felt as though we were alone because we didn't know anyone else who had children with these disabilities, at least not to the degree where we had a close-knit relationship with a lot of people. It was rewarding to know that, okay, we don't have to face this alone. We have people that we can communicate with now. We have resources. And it was just very liberating.
It'll feel good to be able to help that parent with a younger child, to save some of that time, that research worrying time, that helplessness feeling that you feel coming with the realization of the diagnosis.
What's most important is making sure the goals that we have set for a son and things that I know that he is interested in, that is happening. And so in order for to effectively get to those goals, I have to have solid communication, trust, which is only going to be built through that solid communication with the other people who are in his life.
But what I got out of it was a lot of the advocacy part, making sure that you stand up for your child because nobody else is going to do it. Just being empowered, feeling like I have a voice and I can speak up for my son who won't be able to speak up for himself in the future.
So the information I received, it gives you more confidence to go into the school, in the doctor's office to advocate more. So now I learn more information as I kind of with my mind up. So
I feel more confident. I feel that with this information, I can continue to advocate for Kendall in his schools or service providers down the line.
I hope to use my newly learned advocacy skills to try to advocate for things that are not always talked about. We talk a lot about services. We talk a lot about ABA therapy. We need to talk about helping the whole family have a high quality of life, because that's only going to benefit the loved one on the spectrum.
I always like to just pause and show my gratitude to the families who participated in the FACES program and sharing their lived experiences and sharing their voices and sharing, themselves and their children in terms of helping us to learn more about how to support them. But I think that video is very powerful because it speaks to not just what they learned from FACES, but the sense of community that they built. And the sense of agency and empowerment that they've developed, and the strategies that they've been able to utilize in moving forward and supporting their children. And we still stay in touch with quite a few of them, and they've shared with me, some of the successes that they've had in accessing autism services, and some of their kids are getting close to graduation now, and so it's really positive and uplifting for us to be able to maintain those connections, but also to recognize the importance of this work. And so supporting historically marginalized families in community-based settings is really critical. And this goes back to some of the barriers that we identified in part 1 of this webcast series, where we talked about, some of the educational challenges that families have faced historically. And we talked a little bit about why parents experience stigma and why they may be hesitant to have their child identified or agree to special education services. And so having supports for historically marginalized families who are raising autistic youth that are rooted in the community creates a neutral space for families to feel safe, for families to build connections, and for families to learn about next steps, right? Or to learn about what really does this mean for my child and my family. And so for educators, we want to think about strategies that educators can also engage in to support Black autistic youth and their families. So we're kind of bringing these two worlds together. And that's one of the things that I love about the work that I do, because we're thinking about supporting families in home-based settings or in communities, but also supporting educators with bringing that partnership together. And so we'll walk through some of these strategies for our time together today. So broadly, culturally responsive strategies, this is really this framework that ensures that families and students' cultural references are present in all aspects. So again, if you joined us in webcast 1 of this series, we talked about, one student who, we talked about kind of that intersectionality and how there were multiple pieces related to culture that was present. We had the example vignette where we talked about Keisha and what her experiences were, and so the cultural references there. So thinking about how families' cultural influences, their backgrounds, their experiences are always present in the work that we do. And in an effort to respect and address that, we have to be conscious of what these culturally responsive strategies might look like. So next, we're going to talk through some of the fundamentals of culturally responsive strategies. And part of that comes with this idea of knowing yourself, right? Knowing myself. And this ties into another notion that we call cultural reciprocity. These things kind of all work together. So knowing yourself, what is your background? What are your biases? What are your experiences? Where do you come from, right? That's step 1. And also knowing your community. You have to know the families that you serve, the communities with whom you work, understanding the backgrounds and experiences of your students and their families and their overall community. So that's another component of these culturally responsive strategies. And then how can you build your skills? So when you understand who you are and you understand who you're supporting or who you're partnering with, we also need to introduce some tools, right? Introduce a toolbox in terms of thinking about how you can build your skills to better support and engage in culturally responsive strategies with these families. And then when these things all kind of come together, it's how will I contribute, right? What can I do to engage in these culturally sustaining or culturally responsive strategies? So I know myself, I know my community, I find resources and build my skills, and then I contribute, I make a difference. I engage in practices that address the disparities and address the needs of historically marginalized autistic youth and their families. And in many cases, that often starts with just building rapport, right? I cannot express how many times, parents that come through our FACES program or talk to me about their experiences say, I just wish they would get to know us. Like, I wish they would get to know about my family. I wish my child's teacher would just learn a little bit about us or take the time to build that relationship with us. And so building rapport is one of the, if not the most important culturally responsive strategies, especially with regard to creating effective partnerships between families and educators. And so that rapport requires first an awareness of others, very similar to what we saw on the previous slide. It requires that you show interest, that you're sensitive to the needs and experiences of families, that you're also sensitive and thinking about your words, right? What language am I using? And does that make sense for this family? Is it appropriate? And then how do I connect the dots, not only for yourselves, but for the families that you're supporting? So building that rapport sets the foundation for all of the other culturally responsive strategies with which we hope you will engage. Cultural reciprocity, I alluded to this a little bit ago. This is this idea where you identify your own perceptions, like your own biases, your own backgrounds, your own experiences, your values and beliefs, and then you get to know those of your families or of your students. So if you're if you're exclusively teaching autistic youth, then you're going to work to know all of your autistic students' families and understand their values and beliefs. And then you're going to assess the similarities and differences between yours and theirs. And I think for many of us, this is where we start to get a little bit uncomfortable, right? Like we start wiggling in our seats a little bit because we're like, well, that's kind of, weird, or I don't want to create more division or highlight our differences. But that really is the idea behind cultural reciprocity, that we identify those differences, that we work to understand those differences, and then we address how those differences impact the way we engage with other humans, right? And so until we're able to unpack that, it really does make it challenging to engage in culturally responsive pedagogy. And so you want to discuss these differences with your families and then be responsive to them, right? So I've never worked with the Somali family before. This is my first time. I'm not familiar with the language, with the culture, with the faith. Can you share that with me? And then how can I be responsive to your needs? This is a background that I come from. Are there things that we can learn from each other? So really engaging in this idea of reciprocity is really critical for culturally responsive strategies. And then additional fundamentals of culturally sustaining practices or culturally responsive strategies. We'll use those sort of interchangeably. We want to think about how you can understand the ways that a family describes their child's characteristics. And this looks very different in many families and across families, particularly among historically marginalized families. They might describe their child's needs or their child's disability very differently. They might use person first language. They might use identity first language. And so you want to understand what that means for that family. You also want to understand how they make meaning of a disability. And so again, in some families, we see the cultural and religious influences of what it means to have a disability, right? So in some particular cultures, it might mean that this was actually sort of a gift from a higher being, because that higher being entrusted me to take care of this child, right? And other families, from other cultures might say, this is actually a punishment from a higher being for something that I did in the past. And so those are like faith sort of interpretations, faith-based interpretations of what it means to have a child with a disability. And then there are other families who have no sort of connection to that, right? We're sort of just taking it as it is, and we're working through what it means that my child is autistic, that this is a gift, that they are talented in all of these ways, that they communicate in these unique ways. And so it's important for educators and related service providers to really understand how families create that meaning for themselves. We also want to make sure we understand how families cope with the disability. And I say cope here, not in the sense that disability needs coping necessarily, but in the sense that families face experiences that require that they cope in many ways. For example, research shows that moms raising autistic youth experience higher levels of stress and depression. And so they need to cope with the stress and depression. But then there are also some parents who literally feel like they need to cope with having a child who is autistic, right? And so that looks different across families. So thinking about not only how the family copes, but what coping means within the context of their family unit. And then another fundamental is understanding how and where families decide to seek intervention or not seek intervention or support for the disability. And this again kind of goes back to some of the intersectionality that we talked about in the first part of the series, but also about, it connects back to this like faith-based experiences and, you know, do I actually get support? Is it important for my child to receive early intervention, or do we sort of wait and pray about this? Or do we think that, you know, this is having autism is temporary, right? And so this is something that my child will grow out of. And so part of this comes with the knowledge building, but also if we have an understanding up front of the cultural influences that shape how families understand disability and whether or not they choose to engage in support strategies, it really helps you to build more culturally responsive practices for future support. So this is where you really start to build like the foundation of that support. And once you have the understanding of all of these components, you can think more specifically about next steps. So if a family, you know, describes their child's characteristics with deficit language, then that gives you a baseline with which to work for next steps. How do we think about what this actually means, right? For example, one of the characteristics that we talk so much about with autism is restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. So if a family kind of talks about it as a restricted pattern of behavior, and another mom describes it as like these unique interests, and they're very interested in these kind of cool things, right? Those are different ways that we describe characteristics and describe behaviors in autistic youth, and they're often based on the family's level of knowledge, the family's experiences, and in many cases, the family's cultural understanding of what it means to have a disability. So it's critical for us as educators and related service providers to build these understandings. We also want to, at a very basic level, make sure we get to know the students and their families. So that goes back to the earlier point about building rapport. We want to practice responsive and multimodal communication. This is, again, very critical because when working with historically marginalized families, we have to think about modes of communication that are most effective. I hear from my pre-service teachers, probably more than anything else, when we talk about partnering with families, that families just don't respond, or they don't engage, or they don't reach out. And so, you know, while I recognize the challenge of that and that, you know, there has to be two-way communication, we also have to think about what might we be able to do to sort of encourage more responsive communication. Does that mean you use a text message system instead of email, right? Does that mean you send home a physical communication log versus classroom dojo communication, right? So practicing those responsive modes of communication is really, really critical. And it's also another way to engage in culturally responsive strategies. Another strategy is to seek ways to build trust with family members by being dependable, authentic, consistent, and respectful. And I think those are like sort of foundational qualities that families look for in partners and in educators, because they just want to know that like this is someone I can trust to support my child, that has the best interest, you know, for my child, that can be a consistent support for our families, and respects me as a human, respects our culture, respects our knowledge, respects that the parent is in fact the expert in the room. And so for families who are who have faced disparate experiences in the past, or have experiences with systemic racism and systemic discrimination, building this trust and being dependable, authentic, consistent, and respectful is a really important way to be able to build those partnerships. And finally, you can collaborate with cultural liaisons, or what we sometimes call cultural brokers, to support historically marginalized families with and through the special ed process. And some families are able to better connect with the cultural broker. So let's say, for example, a Latino mom might be better, feel like she can build better connections with a Latino mother who also has an autistic child, who's a cultural broker, who can help to kind of bring all the parties together and start to build that understanding of what does the school need, what does the teacher need, what does the family need, what does the student need, and bring everyone together on the same page. So we also think about empowerment as a culturally responsive practice, and that is one of the main tenets of the FACES program. And so I think about empowerment as this social process of defining what is important, gathering the resources that we need, and then taking action to achieve the desired goals. So again, you kind of think about, what's important, what do I need, and then how can I actually achieve the goals that I'm seeking to address. Empowerment is very central in families' efforts to access and improve services, particularly for autistic youth. And we found that strengthening empowerment is very important because of the social injustice that makes families from marginalized communities more susceptible to vulnerability. So when we have families who have, again, faced discrimination, who have had disparate access to services or no access to services, we see that their empowerment levels are lower, and they feel, really susceptible to kind of this continued experience. And we really want to be able to strengthen empowerment in families, among families who come from marginalized communities for that reason, right? We want them to feel better prepared and able to access, utilize, and sustain ongoing partnerships, ongoing services to support their children and support their family as a whole. And in Black families particularly, we think about empowerment as a way to help families gain a sense of control, but we also think about it as a prerequisite to advocacy. So when families are empowered, when they have that heightened sense of empowerment, we see that they're able to advocate more effectively. And so you can engage in this sort of empowerment building or supporting empowerment by doing many of the things we've already discussed, like building rapport, communicating in responsive ways, acknowledging cultural beliefs, and dispelling assumptions, right? Like many of us come in with preconceived notions and assumptions about families. And so as a active way to support families' empowerment, we want to dispel those assumptions that we come in with. And in terms of supporting empowerment across families, our goal is just to provide these culturally sustaining practices that are all rooted in empowerment and that address the multidimensionality or that intersectionality that we talked about in the first set of slides, in the first webcast. I was looking for that word. The intersectionality that we experience as an effort to strengthen student outcomes. So again, educators, service providers, we want to think about the intersecting identities that students bring, that students are, right? Not just that they bring, but that they are, that they represent. And think about ways that you can engage in empowering those identities to strengthen the outcomes for the students that you support. And again, that level, that sort of foundational level of empowerment leads to increased advocacy. So really speaking out about the needs of your child, and your child speaking out about their own needs, that self-determination and self-advocacy, and how do I get what I need for myself, right, to strengthen my outcomes. We also think about the importance of collaboration and partnerships. Again, specific to Black families, I think, and I should have put a caveat in here earlier, I think all of these strategies are important across racial and ethnic backgrounds. But many these have been sort of highlighted in terms of addressing the needs of Black families because of the systemic issues that Black families have faced with regard to racism and discrimination in schooling. And so we think about these from that perspective, but we also recognize the importance of collaboration and partnerships across racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so, you know, for Black children who in many cases are not identified until school age or later, speech language pathologists, for example, among many other related service providers and educators, play a really critical role in identifying and collaborating with parents and educators to establish the needed supports for Black autistic youth. And so we need to be present in the classroom. We need to modify curriculum and strategies or adapt things in ways that are culturally appropriate. We need to partner with teachers. So if you're a related service provider, it's important to partner with the teachers. If you're a teacher, it's important to partner with the related service providers and with family members. And being creative, right? Think about ways or think outside of the box, right? Like what are some new and unique ways to support the needs of your learners? So really engaging in partnerships in different ways, right? With family members, but also with other professionals to address the needs of autistic youth. Some additional collaboration strategies around partnerships. We want to think about supporting family-centered goals by talking to the parents about their experiences, talking to them about their priorities, their needs, and their goals. And it's important to understand that these strategies should not just focus on fixing problems that aren't necessarily seen as a problem, right? That goes back to the cultural understanding of what does it mean to have a disability. So we want to really be clear on that and have a really good understanding of what is autism in this family, right? What does autism mean in this family? What are the implications of that? And then we want to co-construct strategies for Black autistic students. You want to be able to ask questions that you might not know the answers to. And you want to be able to listen to what families have to say. That, again, is one of the biggest things that families have shared with us is that, like, I feel like they just don't listen to my voice, right? They come in and they're the expert and they're the educator and I'm just the parent and nobody listens to me. And so this is a critical strategy in terms of listening to what families have to say in terms of being culturally responsive, like just not just listening, but actively listening and showing parents that you care. And then another strategy here is thinking about self-determination. I think we're sort of approaching a phase where we are approaching a time where we're seeing many more young adult, autistic young adults who are, facing next steps in terms of what do I do post-secondary or planning for high school. And so this idea of our practice of self-determination is really critical in thinking about how do we persevere in the face of obstacles. And for students who have been historically marginalized, they kind of already have previous experiences with that. And they're thinking about, like, how do those previous experiences compare to what I'm going to face in terms of future choice making, decision making, and problem solving, right? How do I get over those barriers? And so we want to help students feel have the advocacy strategies and the agency to be able to move forward in making those decisions about, their education or their vocational training or their relationship building, like whatever it is that's important for them. We want to make sure that historically marginalized families in particular, excuse me, have the voice and have the sort of feel the agency to activate their voice in advocating for their needs. And then specifically for students, like when we're thinking about specific culturally sustaining strategies for self-determination, we want to make sure that we're individualizing transition plans for each student, that we're thinking about ways to include students in the training planning meetings while also honoring their culture and their values, right? So showing how you see how you value their culture and how you've embedded that into your planning and what you might perceive as goals for them. Aligning curriculum and plans with student goals, of course, maintaining multidisciplinary ITP teams. This is also critical, making sure that people come who have varied experiences and who are able to engage and interact with students in different ways, because that also brings more data, but also more experiences that really highlight the multidimensionality of autistic students. And finally, supporting student and family development and involvement in self-determination activities. So if educators encourage and engage in family development activities, it really helps to strengthen students' ability to self-advocate or to engage in self-determination. And again, these are strategies that we want to use for students with disabilities across racial and ethnic backgrounds, but it's especially important to think about families who have very little experience with advocacy and self-determination, or who have had disparate experiences or challenges with trying to engage in advocacy. So for some families, you're almost sort of retraining them to be able to advocate effectively because they face so many challenges with advocating in the past. So I've talked for 35 minutes or so now about, what are these strategies? How do we engage in culturally responsive supports and culturally sustaining practices? And so now we're at next steps, right? What can you do as an educator, as a practitioner, as a related service provider in whatever capacity, even as a parent, right? How have you identified your biases, right? So that's step one. What are your biases and how might you address them? What can you do to address your biases in your work, right? With racially and ethnically diverse families or historically marginalized families. How do you address your biases? And then what strategies are you already employing? So you might say, hey, Jamie, I'm already engaging in culturally responsive strategies. I've implemented this plan in my classroom. I talk to my parents on this regular basis. I use these culturally representative literature or curricula, right? So what are you already doing? And how might you apply new strategies in your classroom or in your setting that are culturally responsive or culturally sustaining? So that's a little bit of homework for you in thinking about next steps. How might you address your biases? What strategies are you employing already? And what new strategies might you apply in your setting? And then part 2 of your homework is to think about how you will achieve the 3 C's, okay? So at the beginning of this webcast, I talked about FACES and how FACES is a community engaged program for Black autistic youth and their families, and how it's really focused on building a sense of empowerment. And although honestly, originally we didn't actually think through the importance of community as a component of FACES, it has emerged as a really critical piece. And so I think that is important for educators and for service providers to think about. For you, how does the work that you do support community empowerment? How can you help to achieve community empowerment in your spaces? Also, how can you support collaboration? What can you do to create better collaboration with historically marginalized families raising autistic youth? How can you create better partnership? And finally, how can you support social change, right? We've talked between the 2 webcasts here, we've talked about the disparities of historically marginalized youth youth, and we've also talked about strategies to address those disparities. So big picture, what can you do in your capacity, in your role, to shift and create social change for families who are raising autistic youth, Black autistic youth, minority autistic youth, and are still facing challenges that have been rooted in systemic discrimination and racism in our educational system here in the US. And I think we all have a role to play in creating that social change, in facilitating and building and supporting empowerment, and definitely in creating collaborative and effective partnerships with historically marginalized families. So I hope that you found these strategies helpful. I hope that you're able to take something away and embed that practice in your classroom or in your setting. And if you have questions about these strategies, feel free to reach out to me at jnpearso@ncsu.edu. And you can also take a look at our website. We have the link here on the screen. You can also screen capture the QR code as well. Thank you so much.